Cool. Okay, we are going to move into our last presentation for the day. So thank you everyone who's stuck around. I think this next one will also be very interesting and informative. Some of the feedback we've gotten at past meetings is that having longer, deeper dive presentations is really helpful for people to kind of grasp some of the concepts and what's required for getting habitat on the landscape. So with that in mind, we had reached out to the Rights of Way Stewardship Council, who runs an accreditation program, which I think, Phil, you'll probably talk a little bit about, so I won't get into the details, but an accreditation program for integrated vegetation management in primarily utility rights of way. And so we invited Phil Charlton to present not only about that accreditation program, but also about integrated vegetation management more generally, and kind of give a little crash course in what you need to know about the principles of integrated vegetation management. So Phil is a principal and owner of Charlton and Associates, where he provides management consulting and expert witness related to utility vegetation management. He's executive director of the Utility Arborist Association, which is a professional association with over 4,000 members engaged in utility vegetation management. He helped found and is now a member of the Rights of Way Stewardship Council and is a lead auditor for the program. Dr. Charlton also leads the team that hosts the Environmental Concerns in Rights of Way Management Symposia series, and he has over 35 years of worldwide experience in the electric and pipeline utility vegetation management industry. So welcome, Phil.
Okay, we can do that. Well, thank you. I will respect the fact that I'm the only thing that stands between you and sitting in traffic, so I will try to keep it going. Maybe. I'll use the arrow.
No, I think I need to highlight. Okay, there you
go. Okay. We mentioned the things that I represent anytime I present. I never quite know who I'm presenting on behalf of. I do represent 3 nonprofit organizations. One is the Utility Arborists Association, which she just mentioned has a little over 4,000 members. This is really an association of the people that get the job done as far as electric and pipeline right-of-way management goes. In addition to that, I do represent the Environmental Concerns and Rights of Way Management. If you're not familiar with it, it is a symposia series that goes back to the 70s, and it deals with any environmental issues related to rights of way, whether it's construction or maintenance. And finally, I am part of the Rights of Way Stewardship Council, and I'll be talking to you about that. The reason I reiterate that is because couple things. I may not know that much, but I have 4,000 members involved in electric and pipeline utility management, and I offer the UAA and the Right-of-Way Steward Council as a resource for you. If I can help in any way to make contact, find information, please feel free to call me. And I'm going to put forth a request to you. Some of you are involved in research or other areas. That environmental concerns and rights of way management is a great opportunity to get your research before an audience that's involved in utility rights of way management. But one of the biggest issues we have with researchers are they take scientific approach, they come up with scientific results, and they publish it in scientific peer-reviewed journals. And the problem is my membership does not read peer-reviewed journals. So we would offer you space for the summary. You know, what did you find and what are the implications? And let's get it into the hands of the practitioners. So we do have a magazine that goes out to our membership, to 4,000 of the practitioners every 2 months. So I would encourage, take advantage of that, and let's help them understand where the science is. I was asked to talk to you today specifically about integrated vegetation management, and I think the key words I heard were nuts and bolts, sort of talk about it in some detail. In order to do that, I'd like to back up and talk to you a little bit about utility vegetation management. I know we have some electric and pipeline utilities in here, but others I'd like you to understand exactly what it is they're trying to do. I'd like to talk a little bit to you about the history of utility vegetation management, and then I'll get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of integrated vegetation management. And finally, I'll end up with the Right-of-Way Steward Accreditation Program, which is raising the bar, looking at sustainable IBM. So let's start with what I will reference as utility vegetation management throughout. I've highlighted electric and pipeline because that's where the UAA membership is predominantly from, as well as that is the focus of the Right-of-Way Steward Accreditation Program. Right now we have an accreditation standard for the electric industry, transmission right-of-way management, and also for the pipeline. I'm not discounting the importance, obviously, of the highway and railroad. It's just this is where my expertise and my focus will be. As we talk about integrated vegetation management, I'll start with pipelines. Right now we estimate that there's about 3 million acres of pipeline corridor in existence that's being maintained regularly. In addition to that, I came across this number in the Wall Street Journal a year or so ago. The projection is that about $14 billion a year will be spent between now and 2035, adding about 300,000 miles of new pipeline. I can tell you that from an industry that is promoting integrated vegetation management as a best practice, as a standard, we have had a good bit of trouble with the pipeline industry, particularly in terms of maintenance. And the issue is primarily about the way that they have traditionally been managed, a lot like the electric utilities were back in the 70s, a very fragmented management of the right-of-way. They tend to be managed out of district offices that manage relatively short lengths of right-of-way. The managers, I won't say aren't professionals, but their profession is focused on the pipeline. Very few have any natural resource background whatsoever, no biologists, foresters, what have you. And it's made us very hard to make inroads into this group to help them understand the benefits. Pretty much as far as vegetation goes, it is a problem. You either ignore it or you mow it. And trying to change that has been a real challenge for us. So mow, and as somebody earlier pointed out, that has definite impacts on the pollinators. As I look at the pipeline and we look at it, we've begun to shift our focus. We look at that 300,000 miles of line that's coming in, and perhaps that's where our opportunities to make inroads are. If we can get them to start adopting some best practices, and if there's any way you can influence or engage them, you know, the picking or the choosing of local native seed mixes, the use of seedless hay or straw or whatever the mulch is, and the right water or erosion control practices. This seems to us to be the area that we need to focus on, only because it's a lower hanging fruit, we believe, than maintenance at the moment. With that said, I don't want to say that all pipelines are that way. Canadian utilities in particular have made pretty good strides. They're a little bit further along in general, and we have some very significant exceptions here in the United States. In fact, I would suggest that the Right-of-Way Steward Accreditation Program, which is focused on sustainable IBM, will be recognizing a pipeline company as the next right-of-way steward. So that's my hope, and it shows that their progress is being made, but it is a little bit of a slow go in that industry. The electric utility industry, though, I have a different assessment of. I think there's tremendous opportunity in this industry. I think they're making great strides, and I think there's opportunities for other groups to partner with the electric utilities. In a way, it too is fragmented. There's about 3,000 different companies managing the distribution and transmission systems that feed our homes. 150 of those are investor-owned utilities. About 300 are municipal or some sort of public utility district. The major or the biggest ones you might be familiar with would be the Tennessee Valley Authority, Bonneville Power Authority, but for the most part, it's small towns and communities. And then finally, we have about 2,500 rural electric cooperatives. These grew up around farm areas. The farmers were the cooperative. They own the lines that service them and the business. So it's a little different segment. But as we go through here, I'm going to show you that the biggest opportunities probably are in those investor-owned utilities. They manage the bulk of the transmission system that we'll be talking about, and they have great interest in working with groups and doing things to promote environmental stewardship, social awareness, and so forth. So what I've done here is I've narrowed my focus. From here on, I'm going to talk primarily about the electric utility industry. Recognize that IBM, when we get there, it's a process. And it's a process that applies to the roadside, it applies to the railroad, to the pipeline, to everyone. It is a process that we believe should be adopted by all right-of-way managers. For the electric system, it's helpful to understand what we're talking about and where we might want to focus our attentions. You may be familiar with this, but our power comes from generating plants. And it leaves the generating plants at very high voltages along what's called overhead transmission lines. Typically, those will run from somewhere around 115,000 to 750,000 volts. From there, the transmission lines carry it out across the country. You see those big towers that are going up the side of the mountain. And eventually, they come to substations. And we've all seen the substations. Those are those little fenced areas with all that equipment, wires coming in, wires going out. Those receive vegetation maintenance, but it's a bare ground issue. Even weeds don't grow there, so not a lot of opportunity for pollinators. But what the substation does is it lowers the voltage from those very high hundreds of thousands of volts down to the primary distribution system. The primary distribution system is still high voltage, maybe from 4,800 to 34,000 volts. These are the poles you see coming down the street, down your neighborhood or through your backyard. And then finally, when it gets to your home, it probably stops at a pole with a transformer like the one shown there. Or if you are in a newer development, it'll stop at one of these pad mount transformers. And what happens here is it steps the voltage down even further so that it can bring it into your house, usually in the neighborhood of 240 volts, or into the businesses as well. Vegetation management takes place on the overhead transmission, as I said, on the in the substations, on the distribution, and then in the yards with that final after the transformer. But really at the heart of what we're looking at today will be the transmission system and the distribution system. Tremendous opportunities exist in those areas. So let's start with the distribution system. We call it a primary distribution system. In the United States alone, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million miles of line. Roughly 500 million trees are being maintained by the electric utilities on the primary distribution system. The average cycle across the country is somewhere around 4.2 years, or let's say 4 years. So utilities are managing roughly 100 to 125 million trees every year. So why do they do that? And of course, safety is always one of the key issues. You know, folks get upset sometimes when the trees in their yards get trimmed or removal takes place. But one of the worst things that most utility vegetation managers that work for utilities can imagine is a child getting killed by climbing a tree, or a tree worker that's not trained to work near power lines, getting too close to those lines. Remember, that's somewhere between 4,800 and 34,000 volts. They also do it for reliability. Trees coming into contact with these power lines can cause outages. They can break the system down, particularly You may know this if you've had any ice storms in Chicago in the last few years. We've seen it a lot in the Northeast with snow, and so safety around the storm type situations is key. Again, 500 million trees, largely regulated at a state level, sometimes at a county level, what the utilities can do. I think about it from an environmental issue. What are the opportunities here? And I work a lot with the Sustainable Urban Forestry Council and some of the municipals and how they focus on the municipal tree programs. Very important, by the way. But I just want you to understand the scope of the distribution tree problem out there. And this is just one example. Seattle has about 582,000 people in 131 square miles. Their city tree population they count is about 35,000. They have a maintenance cycle of a little over 7 years. In other words, they're maintaining a little bit less than 5,000 trees a year. Yet their electric utility, roughly the same area, size, customers, but they have a tree population of 300,000 trees that they have to maintain on a 3-year cycle. So while the municipal is responsible for the urban forestry and some forest in some way, they're managing 5,000 trees. The utility forest has an annual tree maintenance of a little over 100,000. So if your area of interest is in trees and the benefits it brings into our urban areas, distribution, line clearance by electric utilities is a place to focus. When it comes to pollinators, I think about this, 5 million miles of line, tremendous opportunity. You ought to recognize that the utility does not own much of the land that it's on. Those are owned by private property owners. A lot of the lines are very narrow rights of way. They have roads on one side and maybe the cross arms there may be 8 feet. That right of way may be 15 feet, half of it in roadway. So there are some restrictions there, opportunities. A lot of the opportunities are going to be coming through the work with the property owners themselves. When we talk about integrated vegetation management, the environmental benefits that come out of it, generally the focus on pollinators, we're generally talking about this specific component. So if you're looking to team up or partner with a utility, it's important to say who in the utility you're going to partner with, and it's probably going to be the transmission department. The transmission system, again, if you'll recall, is those very high voltage lines. You see the conductors there. What you have to remember about conductors are they aren't static. They don't stay there. Add a little bit of temperature, increase the load, and they begin to sag. So they go up and down regularly. What's more, you have to remember that electricity doesn't go through the wire. It goes around the wire, and efficiency is increased by the surface area of the wire. So naturally, for more efficiency, we have bigger cables, and what happens when we have bigger cables is we have more wind resistance. So not only do power lines go up and down, but they go back and forth. Sag and sway is what we refer to it. And when the wind's working on the power line, it's also working on the trees. So where the distribution system is 15, 20, 25 foot wide rights of way, or probably not rights of way, but easements, here we have rights of way that are much, much wider. This one, I don't know, probably in the neighborhood of 100 foot wide. You know, we may find some as low as 50 or 60 feet, but that's rare, and usually on a sub-transmission line. We get into these higher voltages, suddenly we're talking 100, 150 feet wide rights of way. And then the truth of the matter is, more often than not, you're going to find not one set of structures coming across the hillside, but there are going to be 2 or 3. It's not uncommon to see 300 foot wide rights of way that have to be managed. And remember, we have to keep the trees from growing up into them. We have to keep the trees from blowing over into them. And then we have hazard trees or high-risk trees. They died from the pine beetle or emerald ash borer or whatever that can fall from outside of the right-of-way. So that's the responsibility of the utility manager, and it's done in order to keep the lights on. Just to give you an idea of where the network is, I would guess that lines up pretty well with that I-35, a lot of the concentration in that map that we saw in the last presentation. There's about 450,000 miles of right-of-way, transmission right-of-way in the United States, roughly 9 million acres. I believe if you add Canada, that jumps to somewhere around 13 million acres of electric utility rights-of-way. I'd like to talk to you just for a moment about the history of these transmission rights-of-way. They really started going in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the vegetation manager at the utilities at that time was told just cut the trees, make room for the power lines. That was for a few years, and a couple years later they realized as soon as you cut them they grew back. So the mandate was keep the lights on by preparing for new lines and cutting trees to keep them from growing into the power lines. It was a way they did that. They turned loose an army of men who used hand tools to cut the lines. A very slow, expensive, and a dangerous proposition. By the end of the World War II, though, things started changing in America. We started having industrialization, really much higher dependence on electricity. It had to be reliable, and all of a sudden it had to be cheap. So the focus for utility vegetation managers was reliability and cost. And what they did was they began to take advantage of the mass-produced herbicides that came out, and they began to use them. They were cheap, and you could put a lot of herbicides down. And that probably, for the next 20 or 30 years, was a time of heavy use of herbicides, probably overuse of herbicides, and misuse of herbicides. Of course, we know that in that time frame in the 60s and 70s, the pendulum began to swing. Recognition of our need to protect the environment. And at first, in the 70s, and when I got there, I entered the industry in 78, a lot of tension between the environmental perspective and the folks that had to keep the lights on and safe. But at that time in the 70s and 80s, integrated pest management was becoming more and more accepted in the crop industries. And although we didn't recognize it at the time, the utility industries was adopting something that was running along a parallel course. We called it integrated vegetation management. And they've pretty much been aligned. And pretty soon, we realized that reliability, safety, and cost doesn't have to always butt heads with the environment. In fact, if we do it right, they're compatible goals in many, many cases. From the 80s through the 90s, more and more utilities began to recognize what we call integrated vegetation management as the way to approach it. You don't just mow it, you don't just spray it, but really it's a complex approach to managing the vegetation. By the 1990s, we had adopted it as an industry standard. The American National Standard Institute recognizes IBM as best practice or as a standard. There's a best practice that goes along with that. Most of the utilities, if they weren't there, were moving in that direction. And many, many wonderful things were happening in the 30 years I worked in the industry. Many wonderful environmental things. You go on right-of-way, it's not uncommon to see your rare, threatened, and endangered species that aren't elsewhere. It's pretty interesting to see some of the studies, some of the long-term studies, if you're interested, are out of Penn State, and just how the large mammals, the small mammals, the rodents, the salamanders, everything uses the right-of-way. And, you know, I'm pretty proud of the industry when I semi-retired in 2006. But then a rather catastrophic thing happened. It wasn't a meteor, but it really had a similar effect on the utility vegetation management industry. Now, if you recall, I said that when those power lines get hot, what do? They sag, and when the load on them, the more air conditioners that are on, the more heat, the more sag. And on August something, we'll see on the next slide, August 14th, 2003, it was a hot day. And in Ohio, everybody went home and turned on the air conditioner. and a power line on the transmission line began to sag and it arced. Now you have to remember, a tree doesn't have to touch a power line. It just has to get within 15, 20 feet or whatever it is, depending on voltage, and it'll arc. And a tree arced on a line in Ohio, and it took that power line out of service. Now the air conditioners were still on, so the demand didn't change. It just shifted to the next power line. And when the load shifted to the next power line, that power line sagged, and a second tree was contacted, and that second line went out of service. And the air conditioner stayed on. It did it a third time. And then after the third power line caused outage, or tree caused outage on a transmission line in Ohio, a whole series of things started happening. I think the first initiating factor was some company in Wyoming saw some fluctuation and made a decision that affected the neighbor And the bottom line is the Northeast paid the price. This is New York City and Northeast on August 14th, 2003. 55 million people without power, many of them stuck in New York City, which being a country boy, God, I can't imagine. And the cost of about 10. It was such a significant event that even our Congress and Senate and our president did something. And what they did was they started working on legislation. And by 2005, they adopted a standard. And in terms of vegetation, one of the keys to the standard was clearance. A certain amount of clearance has to be maintained. And with that standard, they attached $1 million a day per occurrence fine. And I can tell you that suddenly something else rose to the utilities, the forefront of their thinking, and that was risk management. $1 million a day is a pretty significant thing. And some wonderful things happened. Utility lines that needed cleared started getting cleared. But I'll tell you, some significant things happened that shouldn't have happened. You take somebody that's faced with $1 million line, he comes out of the executive office and he looks on the line, and I can tell you he doesn't know the difference between a dogwood and a redwood, right? He does know golf courses, and that was for a time beginning in 2006, there seemed to be a push among the utility industry to establish golf courses. And you can understand why. And the way you do it is you mow it from edge to edge and then you side trim it. And let's have grass. And that concerns some of us. There's a few of us that get the opportunity to travel all over the country by the nature of our job. And all of a sudden, yeah, yes, we're old timers and need to move on. I heard that table back there. But the point is we became concerned. And that really was the crux of the beginning of the Rightest Way Steward Accreditation Program. By 2011, the 4,000 members of the UAA said that the number one thing the utility vegetation management industry needed to do was get the utilities refocused on integrated vegetation management because 30 years of habitat were being destroyed. So today, we're maintaining transmission rights of way, largely in some ways because of regulation. It tells us what to do, but we have some flexibility in how we do that on some of the lines. Safety, reliability, and environmental concerns don't have to be left behind. Integrated vegetation management, a best practice recognized by the UAA, recognized by the American National Standards Institute, recognized by the researchers that consistently present at the environmental concerns in rights of way management. And now we have an organization called the Rightest Way Steward Accreditation. It's a Right of Way Steward Accreditation program that is even trying to raise the bar a step forward, trying to get the utilities to look beyond IBM to sustainable IBM. So that's where we are today. I can't tell you that all utilities are practicing IBM because we still have some that are wanting golf courses. They want to minimize the risk. We have a lot that are working hard to get to the best practice standards, and we have an ever-growing number that want to reach sustainable IBM. So what is IBM? I assume most of you are familiar with this. You can find any number of definitions out there. This one was provided to me by Dr. Nowak out of Syracuse University. And really, he likes to relate IBM to integrated pest management. The focus here is on environmental sensitivity and social responsibility, as well as the things that the utility depends on, reliability and economic viability. The 5 key parts of IPM are knowledge. You have to understand the biological pest and the ecosystem in which you're working. IPM depends on thresholds. We don't just go out and treat when there's a bug in the field. We go out and treat when certain population levels are reached. And in integrated vegetation management, you do the same thing. You establish thresholds. It's highly dependent on monitoring, not only the population, but the results of your treatments. And there's a real emphasis on prevention and on biological control. Generally in IPM, you think of a real emphasis on reducing the amount of herbicide used. In IBM, we tend to be trying to reduce all human inputs into the system by promoting the biological control mechanism. Just a moment on what IBM's not. I just say that a lot of utilities, an interesting thing happened. I'll back up. When that outage happened, 80% of the vegetation management programs at electric utilities were managed by people with some sort of natural resource background. Today, that was 2006 when it was implemented. Today, it's about 30%. You can see what's changed is the legal risk. Those things seem to have taken a priority, so it's changed somewhat. A lot of utilities are being managed by folks that may not understand it. They say we are on IPM, we're on a 3-year cycle. Well, IBM is not a rigid set maintenance cycle. They'll say, well, but we use mowing, we use those means of doing it. Well, that's good. That's part of IBM, but that is not IBM. A lot, even of my peers, will say, oh yeah, we use IBM because we spray. That's not IBM. And it's not mowing time and time and time again. So what is it? Well, let's start with the essence of it. It's bringing together all the different means of control that we have. We have to keep the trees out of the power line. How can we do that? Well, we can do that with cultural control methods, manual control methods, mechanical, chemical. But remember, we're using all those with a purpose. And the purpose is to drive up the amount of our system that's maintained with biological control. We're trying to create communities of compatible plants that will compete with and prevent the growth of the incompatible plants, trees, if you will. Our control methods include cultural. We've heard a lot today about planting. This can a lot of times be involved in the new construction phase of lines. We see a lot of utilities doing plantings in cooperation with other groups. I will say that having spent a lot of time traveling around, this idea of planting on well-established rights-of-way, I'm not seeing a whole lot of benefits from a pollinator standpoint. I was out at this site 5 years ago in California, and I went back in May, and I was absolutely amazed because I remember when they planted this site with those poppies. And 5 years later, those poppies are still there, and that amazed me because I don't see that on rights-of-way. Planting very seldom in an operational way has been very successful. I've been surprised at that. And I asked them how they managed to do this over a 5-year period, and the answer was they planted it 3 times. Now the interesting thing is there's places for it. Planting in cooperation with the cities, the highways, there's opportunities. But when we're talking about 500 million or 500,000 miles of line, it really isn't that big an operational thing. The wonderful thing is if you put integrated vegetation management into play, utility after utility after utility, what you're going to find is you don't need to plant. But it does play a role in every utility's program. Hand cutting, manual operations are still a big part of utility vegetation management. What we need to know about it is selective. That's important to us. The problem is it's strictly suppression. It's not root control. So whatever you cut today is going to be back tomorrow in most cases. And I have to tell you that manual operations isn't the answer to everything. It is one of the most dangerous operations for the worker. But it's part of the toolbox that utilities use. They also use mechanical control methods, big mowers. These tend to be used in initial clearing operations, or if we let the lines get out of control. After that outage, there was a lot of mowers out re-clearing line. And these tend to be pretty large pieces of equipment. They're not selective. They cut down your milkweed right along with your redwood. And they tend to be short-term because they don't really do anything to address the roots. But again, they're an important part of the overall operation. Herbicides is also a part of that operation. There's any number of ways to do it, different application techniques. We are driving towards ever more selective strategies, and you can be selective in the technique you use, and you can be selective in the products you use. Back when I started, we used to put down pounds per acre of active ingredient. Today, you put down ounces or fraction of an ounce. And with the right carrier, it's just amazing how little herbicide you have to use. And unfortunately, some of our land, somebody mentioned that we have the MOU about to be signed. UAA is part of that. It really is primarily addressing access issues, but it does open the door for some of these other topics. And unfortunately, our federal land agencies can be the biggest obstacle to implementing integrated vegetation management. Again, control methods, there's any number of different techniques to be used or products. We do have to appreciate the fact that it does provide permanent kill of the plant, but there's some environmental issues that we have to be aware of, and you have to understand the product, you have to understand the ecosystem, and how to mitigate those problems. But again, I want to emphasize we're no longer very often out there pulling hoses and putting gallon after gallon down. Here you can see a sycamore tree being sprayed by this operator, and a year later you see the dead stem, but you'll notice that nothing around it has been touched, and we're moving to ever more selective controls. Of course, the one we want most of all is the biological control. In the crop fields, a lot of times there's a reliance on insects. In ours, again, we're trying to promote that low-growing layer that will compete, and then it'll promote the rodents and the other things that will remove the seeds, that promote browsing to reduce it. And what we can do is ever move closer and closer to a selective strategy. So what's IBM? Well, it's recognized as having 5 basic tenets, and this is what's in the IBM best practices: knowledge, understand the system, then set the management objectives and tolerance levels. Then you draw from that broad array of treatment options. You account for both the economic realities that are important to the utility, but also the ecological and sociological implications. IBM is site-specific, and it is an adaptive process, constant monitoring and revising of the program. Again, this is the flow chart. It is a process, so it's a process that applies to roadside, to distribution, to pipeline, to everything. And those are the 5 basic tenets. I just want to, in practice, what does it mean? We go out to utilities, and utilities practicing IBM have a staff that is trained and knowledgeable about the ecosystem. They have training in place, but it goes beyond that. They have to understand the laws, the regulations, and so forth. Every utility practicing IBM, actually every utility, has a vegetation management program. The utilities doing IBM have an integrated vegetation management program. One of the keys is they sit down, you set the objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? And I can tell you that if it's strictly the veg manager sitting down and setting the objectives, you'll come up with one thing. If you sit down with a multidisciplinary team that involves the veg manager, the lands department, the sustainability group, the environmental group, you come up with slightly different objectives, and you can accomplish pretty amazing things. You establish thresholds for us under the wires. It can be certain heights, but even compatible species have to be controlled when they exceed certain thresholds, because remember, utilities have to get to the structure. They have to have access to the roads and so forth. So it's really setting a complex set of thresholds. We then go out, inspect, and inventory. Utilities inspect every year, and most utilities inspect multiple times per year. But the idea is eventually, whenever somebody, I think maybe was on a 5-year cycle, is that what ComEd's on? Or I don't know. A lot of utilities are on cycles. It used to be that cycle meant we're going to run a mower, or we're going to run our maintenance crews through here every 3-year, 4-year, 5-year, whatever that cycle is. Now, under integrated vegetation management, what you do is you run an inspector through, an inspector that takes a look and assesses the site. And then he makes determination based on the thresholds and the objectives that we're trying to achieve. Yeah, he goes through and he inspects, he sees a site that needs treated, he draws from the broad toolbox that he has available, and that's how integrated vegetation management works. I do want to mention that besides the threshold, one of the keys to IBM is that it's site-specific. In the past, we used to say, do this line. Then we got pretty sophisticated and said, well, go out and mow this from this tower to this tower. And now we say, for IBM, you go out and you inspect the site and you develop site-specific based on polygons, not graphs. So you may have a wetland on the one side. Well, that's going to be treated a certain way based on thresholds and the conditions there, but may be completely different from the other side of the right-of-way. And then finally, I don't want to underemphasize the idea that we have to monitor and then adjust as we go. I talked a lot about thresholds. Well, keep in mind this is site-specific, and in fact, you do have to maintain under that line pretty much. It's a extremely low forb grass composition that we can tolerate. Move out, well, you could tolerate some taller trees, and some slow-growing trees may be allowed to go till the next cycle. And the idea is that we create diversity on the site. Pipeline the same way. They have a pipe zone and a border zone. And as you drive your highways, you'll notice that, I don't know what they call it, but the exact same thing. They mow one path in now, and beyond that, they mow twice a year, and beyond that, different management strategies. Now, in reality, that wire zone, border zone I showed you, we're not a two-dimensional world. It's more complex. But the idea is we're doing sites around the specific conditions and the specific requirements. When it's right under the power line, you have different clearance requirements than you do if it's in a deep ravine, obviously. Here's an example. You'll see those trees halfway through the picture. It shows how they left it where there was extremely high clearance. This probably isn't a real good example of IBM, because what do we have? Fairly just shrubs or forbs. You don't see much shrub cover that you should see in most operations. You don't see the border zone trees that you would expect to see, but they did allow them in the ravine. In fact, he's doing a broadcast spray for whatever reason. Here's another site, a relatively narrow right-of-way, yet the manager was committed to IBM principles. You'll see more diversity in the cover under the wires. These are low-growing shrubs, but you can allow shrubs if they're not growing too tall. But you'll also notice that on both of the borders, you see trees being left that are encroaching in the right-of-way. They're not allowed to get very tall, but they're allowed to exist. And then if you do your songbird studies, where do you find your songbirds? Probably not the center of the right-of-way, and not in the forest to the side of the right-of-way. What they're doing is occupying those border zone areas. Here again, a picture I had shown you earlier. I want you to notice on the right side, as you see that coming in off the taller vegetation, I won't worry about that. Taller vegetation on the right, they allowed that border zone to encroach, but notice how it sweeps in at the middle of the line, or it goes back out towards the tree. So can you see that? And what that is, remember, those wires sway. So you have different zones. You have to manage to the zone, and that zone isn't always linear. You'll notice in the foreground, And actually, as you move through here, but that is a dead tree left standing. And again, where do you see your songbirds as it migrates across the right-of-way? They'll leave shrub covers over the stream beds. You don't have to mow those. You can leave them to keep the shade on the stream beds. And ultimately, what we're aiming for is low volume, very low volume, individual tree control. We've created here complex, low-growing species that the utility can tolerate and a very low cost to keep it maintained. Finally, I know I'm running out of time here, so one more thing. I'll just mention the right-of-way steward accreditation. I just talked to you about the 6 principles that make up integrated pest management, and they make up the heart of the utility best management practices and the standards. The one thing it doesn't do, and that is something that we can do at any utility, those 6 steps. But what the right-of-way steward accreditation program says, you know, we need to do better. We need to move beyond that. We need to be considering sustainable. You know, we can set a bunch of vegetation managers down with the objectives of the utility only, and what we tend to do is think about what do we have to kill? What trees do we have to remove? But if we set multidisciplinary teams down with broader objectives that incorporate or at least consider the objectives of other stakeholders in the right-of-way, all of a sudden we start thinking, yeah, what do we have to kill? But what can we create in the process? And that's where the right-of-way steward accreditation program is taking us. Today, we have a lot of utilities that don't want to do IBM. They want a golf course for risk management. We have a lot of utilities that are on board and trying their best to implement integrated vegetation management. And we have 7 utilities that have already been recognized for their excellence in sustainable integrated vegetation management. And the number of people that are trying to get their programs to enter into the right-of-way steward accreditation program is going to be overwhelming in the next couple of years. So that's integrated vegetation management and the right-of-way steward program. Any questions?